The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host, content creators, or the production company.
Welcome to the Foundations of Freedom with Jerome Huyler. A strong, vigorous economy runs on a division of labor. While some produce the goods, others provide the services we, the people, need and want. But behind everything we do, our work, our businesses, our daily lives, are the political decisions our leaders make in our name. Since we elect the men and women who write the laws that create the conditions in which we all prosper or perish, we all need to be fully informed political participants. The silent majority can no longer afford to remain silent. One of the most valuable services a free people require is the clarification of complex social, economic, and political ideas. Other media platforms offer biting commentary on the hot-button headlines of the day. This podcast service will explore the underlying causes of and the effective cures for what ails us. And this nation is ailing. Ultimately, to preserve the American dream, we will have to retrieve the principles that made that dream possible. But there are more pressing issues and concrete decisions to consider. So please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Foundations of Freedom with Jerome Huyler, where we look past the headlines, beyond the slogans, and into the ideas that shaped America and still shape the battles that we are all living through today. Today's episode 22, The Demise of America's Natural Rights Commitment, asks a question that may feel rather uncomfortable, especially as America approaches our 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So, are we still living under the principles the founders actually believed in? Or have we spent generations celebrating the words while quietly abandoning their meaning? Most Americans know the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We hear it in speeches, classrooms, documentaries, political campaigns, and 4th of July celebrations. But Jerry's argument today is that Jefferson and the founders were not using those words as patriotic decoration. They were talking about something very specific: natural rights, rights that come before government, rights government is supposed to protect, and rights that place real limits, or supposed to place real limits, on political power. One of the most important rights in that tradition was property. The right to earn, to keep, to use, trade, and dispose of what is yours. That raises a serious question. If government was created to protect our lives, liberties, and possessions, when did it become something very different? Something that provides benefits, favors, privileges, and entitlements to some at the expense of others. In today's episode, Jerry takes us into the intellectual history behind that shift. He looks at John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, Edmund Burke, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, David Hume, John Dewey, Franklin Roosevelt, and many others who shaped or challenged America's original commitment to natural rights. This is not just a history lesson. It is a question about whether freedom can survive when people forget the principles that made freedom possible in the first place. Jerry, take us into it, please.
What That was an amazing introduction. You captured so much of what I need to say in this episode, and now let me say it. Let me remind our viewers that in the last two episodes, What Good is Philosophy and What is Philosophy, I discussed the idea that everything we depend on today, everything we have, was a result of Thomas Jefferson and the founders' generation's adoption of John Locke's natural rights theory. Today, I'm going to discuss how that natural rights theory evaporated in America. What were the causes of that evaporation? So, let me start out like this. Americans are about to go hog wild nuts over the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. The cheering, celebrating, and exulting in this summer's festivities will attract millions who yet feel a genuine pride in the country's history and accomplishments. Many in America still believes this is the greatest country there ever was. And it is just that. After all, a country is as great as it is free. And after 250 years, the freedoms guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, such as free speech, a free press, religious liberty, protections for the accused, etc., are still very much honored. And yet, for me, there will be little cause for celebration this July 4th. Why is that? Having studied the American founding era all my adult life and completed a doctoral dissertation on the principles that informed the American Revolution, which was all published under the title Locke in America, The Moral Philosophy of the Founding Era, my 1995 book, I know better. When you consider what Jefferson's Declaration actually declared, you start to realize that the principles set forth in that document are buried beneath 250 years of purely pragmatic political policies. The original significance of Jefferson's momentous declaration is little appreciated and even less understood by today's generations. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for Jefferson were not fancy buzzwords to justify rebellion against an English king in Parliament. They were absolute, irrepressible natural rights to which citizens, if only white males at the time, were absolutely entitled. That included the resolute right to property, to gain, keep, use, trade, or otherwise dispose of one's freely acquired possessions, no matter how meager, no matter how much. Properly understood, property rights form the bridge connecting politics to economics, and they sternly limit the lawful power any government can exert. Are these rights granted by government? Definitely not. Are they gifts from God? Many would say yes, but not the gentlemen of the 18th century Enlightenment. The founders followed Locke in stipulating that, quote, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. John Locke, in his second treatise on government, spoke of three specific natural rights: life, liberty, and property. While Jefferson did not allude to the protection of property as Locke had, he certainly intended to include the protection of property along with life and liberty. As his fellow revolutionary John Dickinson explained during the Revolutionary period, quote, "Let these truths be indelibly impressed on our minds, that we cannot be happy without being free, that we cannot be free without being secure in our property, that we cannot be sure in our property if without our consent others may, as by right, take it away," unquote. If liberty is largely consumed in labor, and it is, and the just fruit of one's labor is called property, whether obtained as wages, salary, or business profits, then the absolute right to gain, keep, use, trade, or otherwise dispose of one's property must be honored and not politically sacrificed for the sake of the, quote, general welfare, common good, or any special interest that pleads for public aid. Although the framers of the Constitution, every bit as much as the signers of the Declaration, fully intended to secure men's inherent property rights, the language they employed was feeble and woefully inadequate. The Fifth Amendment states, "No person shall be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Apparently, the framers of the Constitution believed that language was plain enough and potent enough to secure those rights forever. In this, they were woefully mistaken. In time, the Supreme Court would define due process as any legal procedure that Congress conducted, no matter how much property would be taken and given away under its auspices. This would be called procedural due process, wildly different from substantive due process, which would have protected people in the enjoyment of what was theirs. The Constitution should have stipulated something like, quote, "Every man having the undisputed right to gain, keep, use, trade, or otherwise dispose of his freely acquired possessions, Congress shall pass no law taxing or otherwise depriving some for the benefit of others." It was self-evident for Jefferson's generation that, quote, "all men are created equal," unquote. Now, the Constitution goes on to say, the Declaration goes on to say, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But there is only so much to which the governed can consent. As no individual has a right to take away or give away what belongs to another, so no number of individuals can confer such a violation of sacred right on their elected representatives." Jefferson's government, in short, was to be a protector, protecting all in the enjoyment of what was theirs. It was not meant to be a provider. In sum, governments are instituted among men to protect all in the enjoyment of what is theirs, their lives, their liberties, and their possessions. For the entire course of the country's history, that understanding has been essentially disregarded. In thousands of ways, today's governing institutions are empowered to provide individuals and corporations with special benefits, privileges, exemptions, and immunities, invariably at others' expense. It begins with heavy taxes that are levied so that government can accommodate the demands made by so many special interest groups. Congress, in short, is where counterfeit capitalists and entitlement enthusiasts go to get special benefits at their neighbors' expense. State and national legislators are free to give away the goodies for which special interests have been pleading since the earliest days of the Republic. Any family that is paying upwards of 50% in combined federal, state, local income taxes, property, payroll, sales, Social Security, utility, estate, and capital gains taxes is already half slave, half free. It's no wonder that life is becoming unaffordable. What governments take via taxation was once considered, quote, the just fruits of honest industry, unquote. Today, less than 25% of what the federal government spends is devoted to defending us from foreign aggression and domestic criminality. The remaining 75% goes to redistributing Americans' wealth. There is nothing wrong with charity, and Americans, the freest and most prosperous, are the most generous and caring people to ever people the planet. Most Americans in receipt of public assistance today are able-bodied and of working age. Of course, many are heads of commercial and industrial enterprises that send high-paid lobbyists to the halls of government to plead for special financial advantage. What Jefferson's understood, what Thomas Jefferson understood, and what today's Americans fail to realize is that what anyone earns, he or she owns, whether obtained as wages, salary, or business profits. One's freely acquired income does not belong to society so that Congress can take away and give away as much as it pleases. It is indeed ironic that notwithstanding the explosive celebrations to come, this country is proceeding along the road to serfdom and foregoing its property rights at a rapid pace. The idea of socialism captivates a growing portion of the population. It is openly advocated by prominent opinion leaders and candidates running and serving in high and low political national office. What is there to celebrate, really? So we have every right and every reason to ask, how and when did America lose sight of the natural rights regime Locke bequeathed to us and with Jefferson's generation hoped to immortalize?
Indeed, if John Locke's natural rights teaching was deemed so conducive to the health, wealth, and happiness of the American people, then why did Locke's intellectual influence fade so fast? One intellectual, social, economic, and political deviations stripped men of the blessings of liberty that our founding fathers so fervently hoped to secure for ourselves and our posterity. Why was there a need to search for so many deviations from the lessons the founders left behind?
That, Vlad, is the question I am going to address right now. The United States Constitution was adopted in 1789. It went into effect in 1789. That same year, another world-turning revolution erupted. The French Revolution, was a jarring event for European observers. In short order, notable French leaders would craft a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. It virtually echoed Jefferson's immortal declaration and John Locke's advice to the world. I'm going to quote from this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Article 1. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Article 2. The goal of any political association is the conservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression. Article 4. Liberty consists of doing anything which does not harm others. Thus, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has only those borders which assure other members of society the fruition of these same rights. These borders can be determined only by law. Finally, Article 5, the law has the right to forbid only actions harmful to society. Anything which is not forbidden by the law cannot be impeded, and no one can be constrained to do what it does not order. That language, that's unquote. That language notwithstanding, by 1793, 4 years after the Revolution, a reign of terror overtook the French Republic. Here was a social experiment gone stark, raving mad. Thousands of aristocrats and enemies of the revolution lost their lands and then their heads to Madame Guillotine. This naturally struck terror in the hearts of the European monarchies. Would they be next? The French Revolution posed a stark challenge to the European monarchies. Would they be next to walk the Republican plank? Would the revolutionary violence visited on the French spread to the rest of Europe? England also had a share of struggling peasants. The continent of Europe would soon be plunged into violent warfare. The ultimate result would be an expanded French empire under the leadership of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, at least until his defeat in 1815. Thus did the French Revolution proclaim the natural rights of mankind and deliver something else entirely. While American civilization was expanding and growing in wealth, all intellectual eyes were on the threat posed by the revolution in France. The despotic reign of terror didn't begin until 1793. But as Edmund Burke predicted 3 years earlier, men's presumed rights would eventually dissolve into an orgy of violent bloodletting. Locke's natural rights teaching would be blamed. A number of powerful intellectual voices would repudiate Locke's ill-advised assertion of natural and inherent rights. That included the wildly influential works of Edmund Burke, Jeremy Bentham, and Bentham's intellectual heir, John Stuart Mill. In the 20th century, America's John Dewey, Herbert Crowley, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt would reject the natural rights teaching on which the whole experiment in American liberty was first predicated. 3 years before the French bloodbath commenced, Edmund Burke published his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790. Burke, the founder and father of modern conservatism, held that long-standing tradition should govern human affairs. He scoffed at the revolution principles the French proclaimed, and that was so easily overturned. Rather, Burke could easily see the disaster history would suffer in the name of men's natural rights. Burke wrote, quote, of a situation in which men, irritated by oppression and elevated by a triumph over it, are apt to abandon themselves to violent and extreme courses, unquote. Edmund Burke regarded France's allusion to men's natural rights as, quote, a monstrous fiction which by inspiring false ideas and vain expectations in men serves only to aggravate and embitter the real inequality which it can never remove. Compute your gains and see what it got to those extravagant and presumptuous speculations which have taught your leaders to despise all their predecessors. That's Burke, unquote. Despite all protestations of virtue and the desire to hold the natural rights of mankind, this fatal Republican experiment will, Burke believed, be reduced to anarchy and terror, and in time, tyranny. No sooner will a people proclaim the natural rights of men than will any fanciful claim under the sun be defended in the name of those alleged natural rights. For Burke, the only way to preserve liberty and good order is to retain the customs and traditions that evolved over centuries of time. England revered Magna Carta, signed in 1215 at Runnymede, the Petition of Right, and the English Bill of Rights adopted at the accession of William and Mary to the English throne in 1688. That long and noble tradition, not some fanciful speculation over natural rights, Burke insisted, is what has protected the liberties of the English people across the centuries. Besides, the English king did not owe his coronation to the consent of the governed, as Locke's natural right theory allowed. Parliament found a vacancy on the English throne once King James II fled to France at the time of the Glorious Revolution, and Parliament chose his replacement. So it wasn't Locke that was responsible for proclaiming English liberty, it was the traditions. Burke supported the Americans in their revolution precisely because of the long history of English liberty to which the Americans clung. The French, they thought they could begin the world anew, overturn all past practices, and simply apply a philosophy which was foreign to French historical memory. They bet the bank and lost it all. No other country should gamble with so revolutionary a proposition as men's natural rights. That is what Burke concluded. At around the same time, the highly influential Jerome Bentham also repudiated the principle of natural rights and instead upheld a utilitarian moral philosophy. It would recommend that course of action which could produce the greatest good for the greatest number. The utilitarians defined the good in terms of pleasure or happiness. Bentham called the idea of natural, imprescriptible rights nonsense. Quote, nonsense on stilts, unquote. Bentham believed that every clear-thinking Englishman will see that England's tradition of free trade, so brilliantly defended in Adam Smith's widely acclaimed The Wealth of Nations, produced also in 1776, published in 1776, would be seen precisely for its power to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. The common sense contained in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations all but guaranteed wide assent to Adam Smith's economic model, or so Bentham believed. In his monumental work on liberty, published in 1859, John Stuart Mill concurred. He advanced what has come down to us as the harm principle. Of it, he wrote, the sole, quote, the sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering in the liberty or action of any of their members is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be exercised against any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant, unquote. For all intents and purposes, this is precisely the principle Locke's natural rights standard prescribed. However, Mill immediately added, quote, it is proper to state that I forgo any advantage which could derive to my argument from the idea of abstract right as a thing independent of utility. I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions. The general theory adopted by Bentham and John Stuart Mill is known as consequentialism. The only concern is whether a particular policy will or will not produce beneficial consequences. Of course, every leader can claim that what he wants to do will conduce to the greatest good. Jefferson believed his public policy would do that. Then again, so did Alexander Hamilton, Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Adolf Hitler. As far as Bentham could see, all England appreciated the wisdom of Adam Smith's economic recommendations. It was all but self-evident that Smith's advocacy of laissez-faire capitalism would win the day. And it did for a while. However, confidence in capitalism would dissipate by the mid-19th century. By 1848, economic hardship overcame much of Europe, resulting in the sweeping success of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. By then, Europe's educated elites and millions of ordinary working men rejected laissez-faire and looked to a socialist reformation to achieve the greatest good. In the next century, America's intellectual elite formulated their own consequentialist model. It would be known as pragmatism. Its chief proponent was John Dewey, still thought to be the greatest philosopher America ever produced. During the depressed 1930s, the pragmatic thing to do was to restore prosperous times by whatever means necessary. Franklin D. Roosevelt, an avowed pragmatist, declared that what the nation now needed was, quote, bold, persistent experimentation, unquote. He tried everything he could think of, but the hardships Americans suffered were as great in 1940 as they had been in 1930. By the late 70s, a prominent philosopher named Richard Rorty tied his pragmatist revival to the popular postmodern tradition then in vogue, and he attracted a wide acclaim for his philosophic contribution among the nation's brightest professors. In fact, pragmatism came to America long before John Dewey's day. Alexander Hamilton can be considered America's first pragmatist leader. As America's first Secretary of the Treasury, he recommended a number of policies that found no safe harbor in the nation's founding principles. But George Washington approved of Hamilton's policies, as I explain in chapter 10 of my book on the subject of the founding era, Locke in America, the Moral Philosophy of the Founding Era, which was published in 1995. As we saw in episode 19, the founding principles rendered government a protector, not a provider. If all are created equal, none are entitled to anything for which someone else will have to pay. Against those principles, Hamilton believed the good of the nation would be best served if government would actively promote industrial and financial growth. Economic strength, Hamilton knew, would translate into military strength and afford Americans greater protection from foreign aggression. It made for a compelling case, but it also canceled the natural rights regime. To protect America's infant industries, Hamilton's 1791 report on manufacturers called for bounties, protective tariffs, and other forms of assistance to be awarded to the nation's young industrialists. His plan to retire the national debt at par and let government open a public-private bank of the United States, known as the BUS, gave enviable advantages to the nation's domestic manufacturers, savvy financiers, and stock and land speculators. The end result was not so much vigorous industrial growth as a devastating panic and depression that struck in April of 1792. The sordid details of that panic and depression will be covered in a subsequent podcast episode. Again, see chapter 10 of my book, Locke in America, if you can't wait for that episode. The principled Jefferson, acting as Secretary of State, strenuously opposed the political expediency promoted by Hamilton. How ironic it is that America's free market economy has for so long enjoyed tariff protections and other public emoluments. The problem with pragmatism, and we will look at it at this flawed philosophy in a subsequent episode, is that for the pragmatist, if there's no immediate problem, there's no need to think. Let life go on. Once a problem arises, however, there's no time to think. It's time to act, to do something, anything. If it works, fine. If not, then the agile pragmatist will try something else. Who knows what will work or won't work until it's tried. As we saw last time, this is not how Jefferson and his countrymen approached governance. That's why they put so much emphasis on the rights of men and placed firm limits on constituted power. I want to emphasize the point that most of us don't think about to the extent to which government's due limits were breached long ago. That is a point few of us raise. Few ask quote, is that what precipitated the country's periodic panics and depressions? Is that why the economy fell into deep ditches again and again? These questions require thought and historical study. Pragmatists only have time to act. Opponents of Locke's natural rights philosophy aside, it was a deeper philosophical assault that proved most destructive of Locke's good name and once revered reputation. Denying the reality of innate ideas, Locke insisted that all of our knowledge originates with the evidence of reality provided by our five senses. This is the empirical approach to philosophical speculation I discussed in my previous episode, What is Philosophy? We must see and grasp what is out there before we can start deciding what we should do about it. A few short decades after Locke's death in 1704, a Scottish writer, David Hume, pushed empiricism to its logical limits, then pushed it right off the philosophical cliff. He pointed out the severe limits that reality imposed on the human quest for understanding. Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, a thick book published first in 1748 and reprinted in 1777, formed a full-throttled exercise in philosophic skepticism. Hume not only stripped men of their natural rights, he pretty much denied the human capacity to reach any firm understanding as regards the nature of reality. This Scotsman placed a limit not on political power, but on the limit of man's ability to know what the world is like. Hume eventually gained fame by pointing out how much experience can't convey. Thus, he advised that all the facts in the world won't ever yield a single value. Moral choices are just arbitrary opinions. There are no objective verities where values are concerned. There is no logical bridge to connect a "this is" statement with a "this is what ought to be" announcement. David Hume conceded that facts are discovered via observation, but he considered all value claims to be so many subjective sentiments of approval or disapproval, not objective truths. This meant there would be no way to ever confirm Locke's vaunted natural rights philosophy, and no way to say how limited government had to be. Hume went further. He proved it is impossible to ever conclude that one thing caused another thing to happen. To say that because every time one thing happens in the present or happened in the past, that thing will cause the same thing to happen in the future is to indulge in an unwarranted leap of faith. We have no sensory experience of the future after all. We have no way of knowing if this will be the cause of that 10 minutes, 10 decades, or 10 centuries from now. All men can say is a consistent conjunction between that things that follow from other things happen. To conclude that one action caused another to happen is but a gross and unfounded supposition. David Hume went even further. He reduced every proposition to being either a matter of fact or a relation of ideas. Matters of fact allow us to see the reality of things, but we can't be certain things will always be as they are now. We can be certain of the relation of ideas we form. For example, a bachelor is an unmarried man, but they tell us nothing about the real world out there. They are necessarily true, but just by definition. They don't add to human knowledge in any substantial way. David Hume's radical skepticism drove the final nail into the coffin of empiricism. Locke wasn't around to answer Hume, and no other empiricist would. That is, before the path-breaking career of Ayn Rand in the 20th century, to which we will get to in 2 episodes from now. This, however, wasn't the end of philosophizing. A long line of mainly German philosophers would soon enter the intellectual lists. Immanuel Kant, G.W.F. Hegel, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Herbert Marcuse published their findings, and to this day are regarded among the giants of modern philosophy. They are anything but, as I will explain in episode 23 next time. These men were not like Locke. They weren't empiricists. They didn't begin with the plain evidence provided by their 5 senses. They are best described as rationalists. They began their speculations with some innate idea known by reason alone or some general non-sensory manifestation, and proceeded to deduce certain truths which invariably generated firm prescriptions for action, usually of a collectivist nature. In episode 23, we shall consider the thought of these several rationalist philosophies. What did they contribute to the quest for human understanding? How strong were the arguments they advanced on behalf of their philosophic conclusions, and what were the consequences to which their theories arose?
All right, Jerry. Awesome as always. Let's do a quick lightning round. I'll give you a short prompt. You give me your first serious reaction. A sentence or 2, unless you want to go deeper. Ready?
I'm ready.
Locke, in 1 sentence. If someone never read John Locke, what is the one idea they absolutely need to understand?
They need to understand, from Locke's perspective, and in fact, all men are created equal. That is why all men have the right to live and let live, to live their lives, make their choices, take the actions they think best for themselves, while letting every other equal individual do as much, do the same. Today, we understand that it's not only for white males, but every male of any race, of every ethnicity, of every background, and every female has the same rights, because all human beings are created equal. That is the source, the fundamental source of the rights John Locke decided all men possess.
That's a great answer, Jerry. Thank you. I think more people should read about Locke and dig into the philosophy, the teachings there. I know someone we know has a book about him, right? I think you wrote a book about it. Anyway.
Yeah, but episode 19, which was called How Limited Was Limited Government Meant to Be, describes the basis for men's natural rights and the limits to be placed on government perfectly. You don't have to read my book. You can just go back and look at episode 19 of the Foundations of Freedom with Jerome Huyler to glimpse all that principle of equality entails.
Very
Cut.
good. All right, let's continue. So let's pivot to another question about America's 250th anniversary. As America prepares to celebrate 250 years since the Declaration, what should people be thinking about besides fireworks, flags, and hamburgers?
They should be thinking about the Declaration, which we are all about to celebrate, and what the Declaration actually stipulated, what it said about human nature and about the limit of government power. In other words, they should be thinking about what Jefferson meant when he declared that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and property. And if we look at this lecture carefully, we will understand what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, including the right to property, creates in terms of limited government. And by understanding that, people can just look at what all government is doing today and see how most of what it's doing, 75% of what it's doing, actually violates the rights of individuals, the natural rights of individuals. Cut.
Excellent. That would be nice if more people gave this history, this idea, what we're talking about, more thought. I think most people, including myself, we quite often take this country, its history, all of these things we're talking about for granted. But
Indeed.
last question, Jerry. Ready? Final question.
Let it rip.
What is one question every American should ask before voting, supporting a policy, or asking government to solve a problem?
I think the question they should ask is this within the purview of governmental power? Is this something government exists to do for the American people? Or is government simply doing this to serve the interests or to benefit certain Americans at the expense of other Americans? And what did those other Americans do to deserve having their wealth redistributed or confiscated by the government? And the answer is Americans did nothing but commit the sin of forgetfulness. They forgot what rights they naturally possess and which government has no right to take away.
This was a very powerful episode, like all the others, but this one in particular because it reminds us that freedom is not just a feeling. It's not just a slogan or a holiday that we celebrate once a year or whatever. Freedom rests on ideas. And if we forget those ideas, if we forget what natural rights really meant, what limited government really meant, what property rights meant, and what the founders believed government was actually created to do, then we may keep the symbols of liberty while losing the substance of it. That is what makes this conversation that much more important as America approaches the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence. The question is not just whether we still honor the Declaration with fireworks and speeches and barbecues and get-togethers and all of the parades and everything we do, but the deeper question is whether we still understand what did it declare. Jerry, thank you again for walking us through this history and helping us see how these philosophical ideas still shape the political choices in front of all of us today. And to everyone watching or listening, thank you for joining us as always on the Foundations of Freedom with Jerome Huyler podcast. If this episode made you think, hopefully it did, please subscribe, share it with someone who cares about America's founding principles, and leave a comment with your thoughts. It's on YouTube, it's on Rumble. You can go to jeromehuyler.com. If you want to learn more about Jerry's work, find his book, find links to his social media, the official links. Until next time, keep asking the deeper questions, because a free country depends on the citizens who understand what freedom really means. Jerry, until next time.
Vlad, thank you very much. And let me just say that next time I'm going to discuss, or the topic will be Germany, the birthplace of bad ideas. If you want to understand how philosophy became a dirty word for Americans, how they have such disdain for philosophers and what philosophy is contributing to the society, stay tuned next time and you will understand how philosophy went terribly wrong in the 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you very much, Vlad. Until next time.
Looking forward to it. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Stop guessing how to use AI. Most businesses know AI is important, but they don't know where to start. So they try random tools, chase trends, and hope something works. The real opportunity is not just using AI. It's finding the most valuable hidden bottlenecks, manual processes, and missed opportunities inside your business. Then using AI, automation, and smarter systems to fix them. At Set Up Shop Online, we help businesses grow smarter first, then faster. If you're ready to stop guessing and start building real AI-powered leverage, let's talk. Stop guessing how to use AI, grow smarter first, then grow faster. SetUpShopOnline.com. Let's AI-fy your business.